Chapter 4. U.S. Army Intelligence Section MIS report dated May 12, 1946, titled Report on the Rice Bowl Hill Incident, 1944, document number PTYX-722-8936745-42216-WWN. The following is a taped interview with Dr. Juichi Nakazawa, 53, who ran an internal medicine clinic in name deleted town at the time of the incident. Materials related to the interview can be accessed using application number PTYX-722-SQ-1622183. Impressions of the interviewer, Lieutenant Robert O'Connor. Dr. Nakazawa was so big-boned and dark-skinned, he looks more like a farm foreman than a doctor. He has a calm manner, but is very brisk and concise, and says exactly what's on his mind. Behind his glances, his eyes have a very sharp, alert look. His memory seems reliable. That's correct. At 11 a.m. on November 7, 1944, I received a phone call from the assistant principal at the local elementary school. I used to be the school doctor or something close to it, so that's why they contacted me first. The assistant principal was terribly upset. He told me that an entire class had lost consciousness while on an outing in the hills to pick mushrooms. According to him, they were totally unconscious. Only the teacher in charge had remained conscious, and she'd run back to school for help just then. She was so flustered, I couldn't grasp the whole situation. Though one fact did come through loud and clear. 16 children had collapsed in the woods. The kids were out picking mushrooms. So of course, my first thought was that they had eaten some poisonous ones and been paralyzed. If that were the case, it would be difficult to treat. Different varieties of mushrooms have different toxicity levels, and the treatments vary. The most we could do at the moment would be to pump out their stomachs. In the case of highly toxic varieties, though, the poison might enter the bloodstream quickly, and we might be too late. Around here, several people a year die from poisonous mushrooms. I stuffed some emergency medicine in my bag and rode my bike over to the school as fast as I could. The police had been contacted and 2 policemen were already there. We knew we had to get the unconscious kids back to the town, and we would need all the help we could get. Most of the young men were away at war, though, so we set off with the best we had. Myself, the 2 policemen, an elderly male teacher, the assistant principal, and principal, the school janitor. And, of course, the homeroom teacher would have been with the kids. We grabbed whatever bicycles we could find, but there weren't enough, so some of us rode 2 to a bike. What time did you arrive at the site? It was 11:55. I remember since I happened to glance at my watch when we got there. We rode our bicycles to the bottom of the hill as far as we could go, then climbed the rest of the way on foot. By the time I arrived, several children had partially regained consciousness, 3 or 4 of them, as I recall, but they weren't fully conscious, sort of dizzily on all fours. The rest of the children were still collapsed. After a while, some of the others began to come around, their bodies undulating like so many big worms. It was a very strange sight. The children had collapsed in an odd, flat, open space in the woods where it looked like all the trees had been neatly removed, with autumn sunlight shining down brightly. And here you had, in this spot, or at the edges of it, 16 elementary school kids scattered about, prostrate on the ground, some of them starting to move, some of them completely still. The whole thing reminded me of some weird avant-garde play. For a moment, I forgot that I was supposed to treat the kids and just stood there, frozen, staring at the scene. Not just myself. Everyone in the rescue group reacted the same, paralyzed for a while by what they saw. This might be a strange way of putting it, perhaps, but it was like some mistake had occurred that allowed us to see a sight people should never see. It was wartime, and I was always mentally prepared as a physician to deal with whatever came, in the remote possibility that something awful would occur way out here in the country. Prepared as a citizen of Japan to calmly do my duty if the need arose. But when I saw this scene in the woods, I literally froze. I soon snapped out of it and picked up one of the children, a little girl. Her body had no strength in it at all and was limp as a rag doll. Her breathing was steady, but she was still unconscious. Her eyes, though, were open, tracking something back and forth. I pulled a small flashlight out of my bag and shined it on her pupils. Completely unreactive, her eyes were functioning, watching something, yet showed no response to light. I picked up several other children and examined them, and they were all exactly the same, unresponsive. I found this quite odd. I next checked their pulse and temperature. Their pulses were between 50 and 55, and all of them had temperatures just below 97 degrees. Somewhere around 96 degrees or thereabouts, as I recall. That's correct. For children of that age, this pulse rate is well below normal. The body temperature over 1 degree below average. I smelled their breath, but there was nothing out of the ordinary. Likewise with their throats and tongues. I immediately ascertained these weren't the symptoms of food poisoning. Nobody had vomited or suffered diarrhea, and none of them seemed to be in any pain. If the children had eaten something bad, you could expect, with this much time having elapsed, the onset of at least one of these symptoms. I heaved a sigh of relief that it wasn't food poisoning, but then I was stumped since I hadn't a clue what was wrong with them. The symptoms were similar to sunstroke. Kids often collapse from this in the summer. It's like it's contagious. Once one of them collapses, their friends all do the same, one after another. But this was November, in the cool woods, no less. One or two getting sunstroke is one thing, but 16 children simultaneously coming down with it was out of the question. My next thought was some kind of poison gas or nerve gas, either naturally occurring or man-made. But how in the world could gas appear in the middle of the woods in such a remote part of the country? I couldn't account for it. Poison gas, though, would logically explain what I saw that day. Everyone breathed it, went unconscious, and collapsed on spot. The homeroom teacher didn't collapse because the concentration of gas wasn't strong enough to affect an adult. But when it came to treating the children, I was totally lost. I'm just a simple country doctor and have no special expertise in poison gases, so I was out of my league. We were out in this remote town, and I couldn't very well ring up a specialist. Very gradually, in fact, some of the children were getting better, and I figured that perhaps with time they would all regain consciousness. I know it's an overly optimistic view, but at the time I couldn't think of anything else to do. So I suggested that we just let them lie there quietly for a while and see what developed. Was there anything unusual in the air? I was concerned about that myself, so I took several deep breaths to see if I could detect anything unusual odor. But it was just the ordinary smell of the woods in the hills. It was a bracing scent, the fragrance of trees, nothing unusual about the plants and flowers around there either. Nothing had changed shape or been discolored. One by one I examined the mushrooms the children had been picking. There weren't all that many, which led me to conclude that they had collapsed not long after they began picking them. All of them were typical edible mushrooms. I've been a doctor here for some time and am quite familiar with the different varieties. Of course, to be on the safe side, I collected them all and took them back and had a specialist examine them. But as far as I could tell, they were all ordinary edible mushrooms. You said the unconscious children's eyes moved back and forth, but did you notice any other unusual symptoms or reactions? For instance, the size of their pupils, the color of the whites of their eyes, the frequency of their blinking? No. Other than their eyes moving back and forth like a searchlight, there was nothing out of the ordinary. All the other functions were completely normal. The children were looking at something. To put a finer point on it, the children weren't looking at what we could see, but something we couldn't. It was more like they were observing something rather than just looking at it. They were essentially expressionless, but overall they seemed calm, not afraid, or in any sense in pain. That's also one of the reasons I decided to just let them lie there and see how things played out. I decided if they're not in any pain, they just let them be for a while. Did anyone mention the idea that the children had been gassed? Yes, they did. But like me, they couldn't figure out how it was possible. I mean, no one had ever heard of somebody going on a hike in the woods and ending up being gassed. The one of the people there, the assistant principal I believe it was, said it might have been gas dropped by the Americans. They must have dropped a bomb with poison gas, he said. The homeroom teacher recalled seeing what looked like a B-29 in the sky just before they started up the hill, flying right overhead. That's it, everyone said. Some new poison gas bomb the Americans developed. Rumors about the Americans developing a new kind of bomb had even reached our neck of the woods. But why would the Americans drop their newest weapon in such a out-of-the-way place? That we couldn't explain. But mistakes are part of life, and some things we aren't meant to understand, I suppose. After this, then the children gradually recovered on their own. They did. I can tell you how relieved I was. At first, they started squirming around. Then they sat up unsteadily, gradually regaining consciousness. No one complained of any pain during the process. It was all very quiet, like they were waking up from a deep sleep. And as they regained consciousness, their eye movements became normal again. They showed normal reactions to light when I shined a flashlight in their eyes. It took some time, though, for them to be able to speak again, just like you are when you first wake up. We asked each of the children what had happened, but they looked dumbfounded, like we were asking about something they didn't remember taking place. Going up the hill, starting to gather mushrooms, that much they recalled. Everything after that was a total blank. They had no sense of any time passing between then and now. They start gathering mushrooms, then the curtain falls, and here they are lying on the ground, surrounded by all these adults. The children couldn't figure out why we were all upset, staring at them with these worried looks on our faces. They seemed more afraid of us than anything else. Sadly, there was one child, a boy, who didn't regain consciousness. One of the children evacuated from Tokyo. Satoru Nakata, I believe his name was. A small, pale little boy. He was only one who remained unconscious. He just lay there on the ground, his eyes moving back and forth. We had to carry him back down the hill. The other children walked back down like nothing had happened. Other than this boy Nakata, none of the other children showed any symptoms later on. As far as any outward signs at least, no. They displayed no usual symptoms. No one complained of pain or discomfort. As soon as we got back to the school, I brought the children into the nurse's room one by one and examined them, took their temperature, listened to their heart with a stethoscope, checked their vision. Whatever I was able to do at the time, I did. I had them solve simple arithmetic problems, stand on one foot with their eyes closed, things like that. Physically, they were fine. They didn't seem tired and had healthy appetites. They'd missed lunch, so they all said they were hungry. We gave them rice balls to eat, and they covered them up. A few days later, I stopped by the school to observe how the children were doing. I called a few of them into the nurse's room and questioned them. Again, though, everything seemed fine. No traces remained physically or emotionally from their strange experience. They couldn't even remember that it had happened. Their lives were completely back to normal, unaffected by the incident. They attended class as usual, sang songs, played outside during recess, everything normal kids did. Their homeroom teacher, however, was a different story. She still seemed in shock. But that one boy, Nakata, didn't regain consciousness. So the following day, he was taken to the university hospital in Kofu. After that, he was transferred to a military hospital and never came back to our town again. I never heard what became of him. This incident never made the newspapers. My guess is the authorities decided it would only cause unrest, so they banned any mention of it. You have to remember that during the war, the military tried to squelch whatever they saw as groundless rumors. The war wasn't going well, with the military retreating on the southern front. Suicide attacks one after another, air raids on cities getting worse all the time. Military was especially afraid of any anti-war or pacifist sentiment cropping up among the populace. A few days later, after the incident, the police came calling and warned us that under no circumstances were we to talk about what we'd seen. The whole thing was an odd, unpleasant affair. Even to this day, it's like a weight pressing down on me.